Hello, and welcome to our series on the California Gold Rush. To truly understand the madness that swept the world in 1849, we first have to turn back the clock and see what California was like, asterisk. Before asterisk the gold, forget the images of bustling cities and crowded highways. Picture this, the mid-1800s. California is a vast, sun-drenched, and incredibly empty land. Imagine a landscape that stretches for hundreds of miles, painted with golden hills, towering forests, and rugged coastlines. This wasn't the 31st state of the Union yet. Officially, it was a territory of Mexico, known as Alta California. But in reality, control was a complicated patchwork. For thousands of years, this land had been home to hundreds of distinct Native American tribes. Each had its own language, culture, and deep connection to the specific corner of the land they inhabited. From the Yurok in the north to the Chumash along the coast, they were the original Californians, living in a world that was about to be turned completely upside down. Alongside them were the Californios, the descendants of Spanish and Mexican colonists. They lived on enormous estates called ranchos, some of which were larger than entire counties today. Life on a rancho revolved around cattle. These weren't cattle for beef, primarily, but for their hides and tallow fat that was rendered down to make candles and soap. These products were California's main exports, often called California Bay. Ships from Boston and other faraway ports would sail for months to trade manufactured goods for these hides and tallow. It was a slow pastoral and deeply traditional way of life, governed by the seasons and the rhythm of the rancho. The economy was simple: cattle, some agriculture like grapes and wheat for local use, and trade. There was no industry, no major infrastructure, and very little cash. Wealth was measured in land and livestock. Dotted among this landscape were a few hardy American and European settlers. These were trappers, traders, and adventurers who had made the treacherous journey over land or by sea. People like John Sutter, a Swiss immigrant who built a fort in a private empire called New Helvetia. Right in the heart of the Sacramento Valley, he had a vision of creating a massive agricultural colony. These early arrivals were few and far between, living as guests in a foreign land, often adopting Mexican customs, learning Spanish, and becoming Mexican citizens to legally own land. But the winds of change were blowing, and they were blowing hard from the east. The United States, fueled by a belief in manifest destiny, had its eyes set on westward expansion, all the way to the Pacific Ocean. Tensions between the U.S. and Mexico were rising, and they finally erupted into the Mexican-American War in 1846. American forces quickly moved into California. Battles were fought, but the Californios were vastly outnumbered and outgunned. By 1847, the fighting was largely over. The Bear Flag Revolt had declared a short-lived California republic, and the U.S. military was firmly in control. In early 1848, the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo was signed, officially ending the war. Mexico ceded a massive chunk of its northern territory to the United States, including California. But here's the incredible irony. This monumental treaty was signed on February 2, 1848. Just 9 days earlier, on January 24th, a man named James Marshall, a carpenter working for John Sutter, was inspecting a new sawmill he was building on the American River. Something shiny in the water caught his eye. He reached down and picked up a few small, yellowish flakes. He had no idea at that moment, but he was holding the key that would unlock a human floodgate and transform this quiet, pastoral land into a global phenomenon. At this exact point, California was in a strange limbo. It was no longer Mexican territory, but it wasn't yet an American state. It was under U.S. military governance. Its population was maybe 150,000 people, and the vast majority of them were Native Americans. There were only about 14,000 non-native people in an area that's now home to 40 million. San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, was a tiny village of just a few hundred souls. Los Angeles was a small pueblo. The largest settlements were scattered ranchos and missions. This was the California on the brink, a remote, sparsely populated land of immense natural beauty, with an economy based on cattle and barter. Its society was a mix of ancient native cultures, a proud Californio heritage, and a handful of ambitious American newcomers. It was a quiet, isolated frontier, a place at the very edge of the world. And in a quiet mill race, a secret was just discovered that would not stay secret for long. The world knew nothing yet, but the stage was set. The curtain was about to rise on one of the most dramatic and transformative episodes in American history. Thanks for joining us for this first chapter. In our next episode, we'll look at how the news of gold leaked out, and the slow trickle of fortune seekers turned into an unstoppable global flood. Make sure you're subscribed and have notifications turned on so you don't miss it. We'll see you next time. Imagine this. January 24th, 1848. The air is crisp near the American River in Coloma, California. A man named James W. Marshall is working, inspecting the newly built tail race of a sawmill he's constructing for his boss, John Sutter. As he stares into the clear, cold water, something catches his eye. A glint. Sparkle. He reaches down, his heart starting to beat a little faster. In his hand, he holds a few small, shiny specks. Could it be? He dismisses it at first. Probably just fool's gold, pyrite, but the specks are heavy, and they don't break when he bites them. This is different. This feels real. This wasn't just any discovery. This was a spark that would ignite the largest mass migration in American history. James Marshall, a humble carpenter, had just found gold. He carefully gathered a few more flakes, his mind racing. He knew he had to show his boss, John Sutter. Sutter was a prominent landowner, a Swiss immigrant who had built a vast agricultural empire he called New Helvetia. His dream was to create a flourishing colony, a peaceful farming utopia. When Marshall burst into Sutter's office, breathless and excited, he unfolded a cloth to reveal the golden flakes. Sutter, a more cautious and methodical man, immediately understood the gravity of the situation. He took Marshall into a private room and they conducted a simple chemical test using nitric acid from a nearby apothecary. The results were undeniable. The flakes didn't tarnish. It was pure gold. But instead of celebrating, a wave of dread washed over John Sutter. He saw his dream of a quiet agricultural empire crumbling before his eyes. He knew what a gold discovery would mean. It would mean a flood of prospectors, chaos, and the end of his control. His workers would abandon their posts, his crops would rot in the fields, and his land would be overrun by treasure seekers who cared nothing for his vision. Sutter's immediate reaction was not one of joy, but of deep-seated fear. He made Marshall and the other workers at the mill swear an oath of secrecy. He pleaded with them, begged them to keep this quiet, at least for a few more weeks, so he could secure his land claims and prepare for the inevitable storm. The men agreed. They swore they wouldn't tell a soul. But a secret this big, this monumental, is like trying to hold water in your hands. It's bound to leak. Despite Sutter's desperate attempts to contain the news, whispers began to circulate. One of the workers, a woman who cooked for the mill hands, mentioned it to a storekeeper in exchange for some goods. A teamster delivering supplies saw the men secretly panning for gold on their off hours and carried the story with him. The secret was unraveling, thread by thread. The most famous leak came from a talkative man named Sam Brannan. Brannan was a shrewd businessman and newspaper publisher in the tiny, sleepy port town of San Francisco. When he heard the rumors, he saw an opportunity, not in mining gold himself, but in mining the miners. He quietly bought up every pickaxe, shovel, and pan he could find in the region. Then, one day in May 1848, he made his move. He ran through the streets of San Francisco, waving a bottle filled with gold dust in the air, shouting at the top of his lungs, "Gold! Gold! Gold! Gold!" from the American River. That was it. The dam of secrecy broke, and the floodgates opened. Sam Brannan's dramatic announcement was the point of no return. The news spread like wildfire, first through California, then up the coast to Oregon, and across the seas to Hawaii and Latin America. By the end of the year, President James K. Polk himself confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress, making it official to the rest of the United States and the world. The secret was out, and John Sutter's worst fears were about to become a reality. The quiet carpenter, James Marshall, and unknowingly changed the course of history with a few shiny specks in a riverbed. The California Gold Rush had begun. What happened next was a tidal wave of humanity. People from every corner of the globe dropped everything, their farms, their jobs, their families, and embarked on the perilous journey to California. They became known as the 49ers, named for the year 1849 when the rush hit its peak. They traveled by land across treacherous mountains and deserts. They sailed for months around the tip of South America. They braved disease and danger on the Isthmus of Panama, all for a chance, however slim, to strike it rich. For James Marshall, the man who started it all, fame brought no fortune. He was hounded by prospectors demanding he show them where to find more gold. His land was overrun, and he spent years in frustrating legal battles, never profiting from his monumental discovery. He died in poverty, a testament to the ironic and often cruel twists of history. And John Sutter, his agricultural empire was completely destroyed, just as he had feared. His workers deserted him. His livestock was stolen. His fields were trampled, and his properties were seized by squatters. He too died a disappointed and broken man, having lost everything to the very gold found on his land. The story of James Marshall's discovery is a powerful reminder of how a single, seemingly small event can trigger an avalanche of consequences, transforming landscapes, economies, and countless individual lives forever. It's a tale of hope and desperation, of fortune and ruin, all starting with that fateful glimmer in the waters of the American River. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey back in time. If you enjoyed this story, don't forget to hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more chapters from history. Let me know in the comments what you think about Marshall and Sutter's story. We'll see you in the next video. Video begins. Hello and welcome back to our journey into the heart of history. In our last chapter, we left off with James Marshall's quiet, almost unbelievable discovery at Sutter's Mill. A secret too monumental to keep. Today, in Chapter 3, we witness how a single spark of gold ignites a global firestorm. This is the story of how whispers turned into a full-blown frenzy. Imagine this. It's early 1848 in California. News travels at the speed of a horse or a ship. At first, the stories of gold were just that, stories. Whispers traded in dusty saloons in San Francisco and Monterey. Did you hear about the glitter in the American River? Most people just shrugged it off. Gold discoveries had been claimed before and usually amounted to nothing. It was just another tall tale from the frontier, right? But some people were listening closely. One of the first to truly grasp the scale of what was happening was a man named Samuel Brennan. Brennan was a shrewd businessman, a publisher, and a store owner. He saw the rumors not just as news, but as an opportunity. While others were skeptical, Brennan started quietly buying up every pickaxe, shovel, and pan he could find. Then, one day in May 1848, he decided it was time to light the fuse. He ran through the streets of San Francisco, a small bottle filled with gold dust held high above his head, shouting for all to hear. Gold, gold, gold from the American River. That was the moment the local skepticism shattered. San Francisco, a sleepy port town, practically emptied overnight. Men abandoned their jobs, sailors jumped ship, and soldiers deserted their posts, all racing towards the foothills of the Sierra Nevada. The local rush had begun. For the next few months, the gold fever was mostly a Californian affliction. The news trickled out slowly. Letters sent by ship took months to reach the East Coast or Europe. Sailors would arrive in distant ports with pouches of gold and incredible stories, but these were often dismissed as sailors' yarns. The world remained largely oblivious. The real turning point, the moment the rumor was legitimized on a national and global scale, came from the highest office in the United States. On December 5, 1848, President James K. Polk stood before the U.S. Congress to deliver his State of the Union address. He had received a report from Colonel Richard Mason, the military governor of California, confirming the unbelievable. And President Polk didn't mince words. He declared to Congress, and by extension to the world, the accounts of the abundance of gold in that territory are of such an extraordinary character as would scarcely command belief were they not corroborated by the authentic reports of officers in the public service. He didn't just say there was gold. He presented the official, government-stamped proof. A tea caddy filled with 230 ounces of pure California gold was put on display at the War Department. Suddenly, it wasn't a rumor anymore. It was a fact certified by the President of the United States. The effect was instantaneous and explosive. Newspapers on the East Coast, which had previously treated the story as a curiosity, now splashed it across their front pages in massive headlines. The gold mines of California. An age of gold. Ho for California. They printed letters from prospectors, official government reports, and editorials that painted a picture of a paradise where a man could get rich with nothing more than a shovel and a bit of luck. These weren't just dry reports. They were sensationalist accounts, designed to sell papers and capture the imagination. They told stories of men digging up fortunes in a single day, of riverbeds literally paved with gold. One newspaper famously claimed you could collect gold with a spoon. The reality was much harder, but the myth was far more compelling. The news spread like wildfire through every channel imaginable. Merchants returning from California brought not only goods, but also gold dust and first-hand accounts that electrified their home cities. Sailors, who had seen the abandoned ships in San Francisco's harbor, spread the word in every port they visited. From Boston to Liverpool, from Hawaii to Hong Kong, the California question was on everyone's lips. This wasn't just an American phenomenon. It was global. News crossed the Atlantic, and soon, people in Europe, struggling with economic hardship and political turmoil, saw California as a beacon of hope, a chance to start over. In Latin America, experienced miners from Mexico and Chile packed their tools, ready to apply their skills in this new El Dorado. In China, word of Gamsan, or Gold Mountain, offered an escape from poverty and war. The world was shrinking, and the lure of gold was a universal language. Guidebooks, many of them wildly inaccurate, were hastily printed and sold to eager adventurers. Companies formed overnight to sell passage on ships, often unseaworthy vessels repurposed for the mad dash to California. The entire machinery of society commerce, media, government was now pointed in one direction, west. And so, the stage was set. The whispers had become a roar. The rumor had become a government-sanctioned truth. The frenzy had taken hold of the world's imagination. Tens of thousands of people, soon to be known as the 49ers, were now preparing for the journey of a lifetime. A journey that would be fraught with peril, hardship, and, for most, disappointment. But in the closing days of 1848, all anyone could see was the golden promise shimmering on the horizon. The Great Migration was about to begin, and it would change California and the world forever. Thanks so much for joining us for this chapter. The story is only getting bigger from here. If you're enjoying this deep dive into history, please hit that like button, and be sure to subscribe and turn on notifications so you don't miss Chapter 4, where we'll follow the incredible and dangerous journeys of the 49ers as they race to Gold Mountain. We'll see you next time. Welcome back to our series on the California Gold Rush. In our last chapter, we saw James Marshall's quiet discovery at Sutter's Mill. Today, in Chapter 4, we're diving into the explosive moment that secret finally broke, igniting a frenzy that would change California forever. This is the first rush. Californians joined the hunt. Before the world caught gold fever, the news first rippled through California's local communities. Imagine this. You're a farmer, a shopkeeper, a soldier stationed in Monterey, or a Californio tending your family's rancho, a legacy held for generations. Your life is predictable, built on the rhythm of seasons and trade. Then, a whisper arrives, carried on the wind, a rumor so incredible it borders on fantasy. There's gold in the American River, not just a little, piles of it, free for the taking. At first, many were skeptical. Gold, lying in riverbeds. It sounded like a tall tale, but the whispers grew louder, more insistent. Men started returning from the foothills, their pockets heavy, their eyes wide with a manic gleam. They didn't just have stories. They had proof. Small pouches filled with gleaming flakes and nuggets, tangible evidence of a world turned upside down. One of the key figures in spreading the news was Sam Brannan. He had a vested interest in this, running a store at Sutter's Fort. One day in May 1848, Brannan stormed through the streets of San Francisco, waving a bottle full of gold dust and shouting, "Gold, gold, gold," from the American River. That was the spark that lit the fuse. Suddenly, skepticism evaporated, replaced by an electrifying, all-consuming urgency. The gold fever wasn't just a metaphor. It was a real, palpable social contagion. It infected everyone. Why would you spend a month plowing a field for a meager return when you could potentially pull a year's wages from a river in a single day? The logic was intoxicating and undeniable. The effect was instantaneous and dramatic. The social fabric of California began to unravel at an astonishing speed. In San Francisco, a sleepy port town just beginning to find its feet, the change was apocalyptic. The two local newspapers, the Californian Asterisk and the California Star, were forced to shut down. Why? Their entire staff, printers, editors, and delivery boys had all dropped their tools and headed for the hills. In one famous instance, the publisher of the Californian Asterisk printed a final, exasperated notice, announcing a suspension of publication because his entire workforce had run off to the mines. He then promptly followed them. Sailors arriving in San Francisco Bay would hear the news, and entire crews would desert their ships, sometimes leaving captains stranded with valuable cargo sitting in the harbor. At one point, the bay became a floating ghost town, a forest of masts from hundreds of abandoned vessels, their crews having vanished into the interior. The military wasn't immune either. Soldiers deserted their posts in droves, trading their uniforms for pickaxes and pans. Their commanding officers were powerless to stop them. What good was the threat of military discipline when unimaginable wealth seemed just a few days' journey away? Towns like Monterey and San Jose were virtually emptied of their male population. Fields were left unplowed, harvests rotted on the vine, and construction on new buildings halted overnight. Blacksmiths, carpenters, lawyers, doctors didn't matter your profession. The promise of gold was a great equalizer, a siren song that few could resist. A man's life savings could be eclipsed by a single lucky find. This wasn't just an opportunity. It felt like a destiny calling, and it wasn't just the recent American settlers. The Californios, the Spanish-speaking residents who had lived there for generations, also joined the rush, while some of the elite rancho owners were hesitant to abandon their vast land holdings. Many of their vaqueros and laborers saw a chance for economic independence they never dreamed possible. They brought with them invaluable skills, particularly their knowledge of the land and horsemanship, which were crucial in the rugged terrain of the goldfields. Native American communities were also swept up in this whirlwind, but their experience was far more complex and often tragic. Some individuals and groups were employed by or partnered with white prospectors, like John Sutter and James Marshall, who used their labor to mine the riverbeds. For a brief period, some native people were able to trade gold for goods, leveraging the chaos to their advantage. However, this initial phase was short. The influx of aggressive, land-hungry miners would soon lead to widespread violence, displacement, and the destruction of their way of life. A dark chapter we will explore in more detail later in our series. As people flooded from the coastal towns and inland farms toward the Sierra Nevada foothills, the landscape itself began to transform. Where there had been quiet, wooded valleys, mining camps erupted almost overnight. These weren't towns. They were chaotic, makeshift collections of tents, crude lean-tos, and rough shanties. Places with names like Hangtown, Skunk Gulch, and Poker Flat became the new centers of California life. They were lawless, dirty, and dangerous, but they pulsed with energy and hope. Life in these early camps was rudimentary. The first wave of miners, the 48ers, were mostly locals who traveled light. They brought little more than a pick, a shovel, and perhaps a sturdy knife or a tightly woven basket to pan for gold. Their methods were simple. They waded into the ice-cold streams, scooped up gravel from the riverbed, and patiently washed it away, hoping to see the glint of color left behind. It was back-breaking work, standing hunched over in freezing water for 12 hours a day under the scorching California sun. But the rewards could be staggering. Stories from these first few months are legendary. Prospectors described rivers so rich that gold was literally lying on the ground, visible to the naked eye. Some claim to have collected thousands of dollars worth of gold in a single week, an astronomical sum at the time, equivalent to decades of normal wages. These incredible tales, often exaggerated but rooted in truth, were the fuel that kept the fever burning. This initial rush by Californians was a unique moment in time. It was a local phenomenon, a family secret that the world had not yet discovered. For a few precious months, the goldfields belonged to those who were already there. They had a head start, and they reaped the benefits of mining the most accessible, untouched deposits. But their monopoly on this secret was fragile. Every letter sent home, every sailor who jumped ship and wrote to his family, was a ticking clock. The news was spreading, carried on the very same ships that brought goods and people to California's shores. By the end of 1848, the secret was out. The news reached the east coast of the United States, and President James K. Polk Massell confirmed the discovery in his address to Congress. The stage was set for a migration of historic proportions. The local rush, the frantic scramble of Californians, was about to be dwarfed by a global stampede. The 48ers would soon be joined by the 14. The world was coming to California, and the quiet foothills that had been transformed by a few thousand locals were about to be overwhelmed by hundreds of thousands of fortune seekers from every corner of the globe. The first rush was over, but the real gold rush was just beginning. Thank you so much for joining me for this chapter. The story is only getting bigger from here. In our next episode, we'll follow the first wave of prospectors from around the world as they embark on the perilous journey to California, forever changing its destiny. If you're enjoying this series, please hit that like button, subscribe to the channel, and ring the notification bell so you don't miss a single part of this incredible story. We'll see you next time. Word of the gold strike in California didn't just stay within the United States. It was a secret too big, too electrifying to be contained. Imagine a whisper that starts on one side of a quiet room and, in moments, becomes a deafening roar. That's what happened in 1848 and into 1849. The news of gold, carried by letters, newspapers, and sailors, began to ripple across the globe, reaching every corner of the civilized world and igniting a global fever. It was a call to adventure, a promise of unimaginable wealth, and the world was listening intently. First, the news swept south, down the Pacific coast to Latin America, in places like Mexico, Peru, and Chile, which had their own long and storied histories with gold and silver mining. The reports from California sounded almost mythical, but the evidence was undeniable. Ships arriving from San Francisco carried not just stories, but actual gold dust and nuggets. For experienced miners and adventurous young men tired of the political and economic turmoil in their own countries, the call was irresistible. They were among the very first to arrive, bringing with them valuable mining skills and techniques that would prove essential in the early days of the rush. Thousands packed their bags, boarded vessels, and sailed north, becoming the first wave of a truly international migration. Then, the call crossed the vast Pacific Ocean, reaching the shores of China. In the southern provinces, particularly Guangdong, life was incredibly difficult. Political instability from the Qing dynasty, coupled with economic hardship and famine, made the prospect of Gamson, or Gold Mountain, seem like a divine opportunity. Brokers and shipping agents painted a picture of a land where a man could get rich with just a pan and a bit of hard work. For countless young Chinese men, this was a chance not just to change their own fortunes, but to support their families back home. They signed contracts, endured perilous sea voyages, and arrived in California, bringing their incredible work ethic, resilience, and rich cultural traditions to the chaotic gold fields. They faced immense prejudice, but their determination to succeed was unbreakable. Simultaneously, the news traveled even further, all the way to Australia. At the time, Australia was still a collection of British colonies, and many of its inhabitants were familiar with hardship and the idea of starting anew. When ships from America docked in Sydney and Melbourne with tailies of gold just lying in the rivers, it sparked a sensation. Ironically, a few years later, gold would be discovered in Australia itself, triggering its own massive gold rush. But in 1849, the allure of California was overwhelming. Experienced prospectors, former convicts seeking a new life, and merchants smelling opportunity all joined the exodus. undertaking the long and arduous journey across the Pacific, hoping to strike it rich on a different continent. And of course, the news reached Europe. From the bustling ports of Britain and France to the fields of Germany and Italy, newspapers published sensational headlines about the California goldfields. For a continent still reeling from the widespread revolutions and economic depressions of 1848, America had always been a symbol of opportunity. Now, that opportunity had a name. Gold. Farmers who had lost their land, artisans whose jobs were disappearing, and young men with no inheritance saw a path to a future they could only dream of in their homelands. They sold their possessions, pooled their money with family, and booked passage on crowded ships for the months-long journey. Either around Cape Horn or across the Isthmus of Panama, they came from every walk of life, driven by a shared, desperate hope. This massive, global influx of people in 1849 gave rise to a new name, a legendary title, the 49ers. This term didn't just mean they arrived in that year. It became a symbol for the very spirit of the gold rush. A 49er was someone who had risked everything. They weren't just taking a trip. They were betting their entire lives on a dream. They were farmers who left their plows in the fields, merchants who shuttered their shops, doctors who abandoned their practices, and husbands who said gut-wrenching goodbyes to their wives and children, promising to return as wealthy men. They sold their homes, their heirlooms, anything of value to afford the passage and a basic set of supplies. This act of leaving everything behind, of severing ties with their old lives for the slim chance of a new one, is what defined them. It was an act of supreme optimism, or perhaps supreme desperation. The scale of this migration was staggering, and nothing illustrates it better than the ghost fleet of San Francisco Bay. As ships from around the world sailed through the Golden Gate and into the harbor, they were often abandoned on the spot. Captains, officers, and entire crews would hear the stories, see the gold dust being traded in the streets, and catch the gold fever themselves. In a matter of hours, a ship's crew would desert, grabbing whatever provisions they could carry and heading for the hills. There was no one to sail the ships back, and no one to unload their cargo. Soon, the harbor became a tangled, floating forest of masts. Hundreds of shipsbarks, schooners, and clippers from every nation were left to rot at anchor. It was a surreal sight. A massive, silent fleet, with no sailors. Some of these ships were eventually repurposed, dragged ashore to be used as makeshift warehouses, hotels, saloons, and even a jail. As San Francisco grew at a dizzying pace, the city literally expanded over them. The waterfront was filled in, and many of these abandoned vessels became the foundations for the new city. Today, buried deep beneath the streets of San Francisco's financial district, lie the skeletons of these forgotten ships, a testament to the moment the world dropped everything and rushed to California. The call had been heard, and the world had answered. Thank you so much for watching. If you found this chapter of history as fascinating as I do, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more stories like this. We'd love to have you as part of our community. See you in the next video. Hello everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into Chapter 6, The Grueling Journey West. We've talked about the dreams and the promise of gold. But what was the reality of getting there? For the hundreds of thousands who caught gold fever, the journey itself was the first, and often the most brutal, test of their resolve. It wasn't a simple trip. It was a life-altering ordeal that sifted the determined from the defeated. The 49ers had three main choices, and none of them were easy. The first, and most famous, was the overland route. This meant packing your life into a covered wagon and trekking nearly 2,000 miles across the vast, untamed American continent, following trails like the Oregon and later the California Trail. This was a journey that could take anywhere from 4 to 6 months. Imagine saying goodbye to your family, knowing you wouldn't see them for half a year, if ever again. These overland travelers, or emigrants as they were called, usually started their journey in spring from towns like St. Joseph or Independence, Missouri. They had to time it perfectly. Leave too early, and the grasses on the plains wouldn't have grown enough to feed their livestock. Leave too late, and you risked getting caught by deadly winter snows in the Sierra Nevada mountains, a fate that befell the infamous Donner Party just a few years earlier. The trail was a gamble from the very first step. The second option was the sea route, A marathon voyage of 18,000 nautical miles. This involved boarding a ship on the East Coast, sailing all the way down the Atlantic, navigating the treacherous, stormy waters around Cape Horn at the southern tip of South America, and then sailing all the way back up the Pacific to San Francisco. This journey could take a staggering 5 to 8 months. While it avoided the dust and strain of the overland trail, it had its own set of dangers. Life on these ships was far from a pleasure cruise. Passengers were crammed into tight, often unsanitary quarters. The food, consisting mainly of salted meats and hardtack biscuits, was monotonous and often became infested with weevils. Storms were a constant threat. The passage around Cape Horn was legendary for its hurricane-force winds and monstrous waves that could splinter a ship to pieces. Many vessels, and everyone on them, simply vanished without a trace, swallowed by the unforgiving sea. Then there was the third option, a supposed shortcut, the Panama route. This seemed like the best of both worlds. You'd take a ship from the East Coast to the Isthmus of Panama, travel about 60 miles overland through the jungle, and then catch another ship on the Pacific side to California. This could cut the travel time down to just a few months. But shortcut was a dangerously misleading term. The journey across the isthmus was a nightmare. Travelers had to navigate dense, suffocating jungles, cross raging rivers in dugout canoes, and endure swarms of mosquitoes. The real killer here wasn't the terrain. It was disease. Cholera, yellow fever, and malaria were rampant in the tropical climate. Many 49ers who survived the ocean voyage succumbed to a fever in the Panamanian swamps, their dreams of gold buried with them far from home. The port towns on the Pacific side were often overcrowded with desperate men waiting for a ship, sometimes for weeks, creating a perfect breeding ground for epidemics. Regardless of the chosen path, hardship was the constant companion. On the overland trails, disease was the single greatest killer. Cholera, spread by contaminated water sources, could tear through a wagon train with terrifying speed. People could be healthy in the morning and gone by nightfall. The trail was lined with makeshift graves, somber reminders of the journey's toll. One traveler noted, "The road is a graveyard from beginning to end." And then there was the sheer exhaustion. Days consisted of walking 15 to 20 miles beside a slow-moving wagon under a blazing sun, breathing in choking dust kicked up by hundreds of animals and wagons ahead. The labor was relentless, tending to livestock, repairing broken wagon wheels, gathering fuel, and standing guard at night against potential threats. The physical and mental strain was immense, pushing people to their absolute limits. Accidents were also horrifyingly common. Children fell from wagons and were crushed beneath the heavy wheels. People drowned, trying to ford swollen rivers. Accidental gunshot wounds were frequent in camps filled with inexperienced and armed travelers. The journey was a daily struggle for survival against a landscape that was both beautiful and utterly indifferent to human suffering. And of course, there was hunger. Supplies could run low, and hunting was unreliable. If your oxen or mules died, your wagon and all your worldly possessions had to be abandoned. The trail was littered with discarded furniture, trunks, and tools that jettisoned hopes of those who had to lighten their load to survive. By the time they reached the final, grueling stretches through the deserts of Nevada and the mountains of the Sierra, many were on the brink of starvation, their animals collapsing from thirst and exhaustion. Yet, amidst the tragedy, there were incredible stories of perseverance. We see diaries filled with entries about the kindness of strangers, of wagon trains banding together to help a family in need, of sharing the last of their water or flour. People celebrated births and mourned losses together, forming powerful bonds forged in shared hardship. These were ordinary people doing extraordinary things, driven by a hope so powerful it made them endure the unimaginable. Think of the Lucina Stanley Wilson, who crossed the plains with her husband and 2 small children. She later wrote about the crushing loneliness and the constant fear, but also about her own resilience, learning to drive the team, cook over a campfire, and keep her family safe. She, like many women on the trail, was not a passive passenger, but an essential partner in the arduous enterprise. The journey west was not just a physical trek. It was a psychological crucible. It stripped away the comforts of civilization and tested the very core of a person's character. Some were broken by it, turning to despair or selfishness, but many others discovered a strength they never knew they had. They faced death, disease, and destitution, and they kept going, step by painful step, mile by grueling mile, all for the chance at a better life waiting in the golden hills of California. This journey shaped them, and in turn, it shaped the American West. Thank you so much for joining me on this leg of our journey. The story of the gold rush is as much about the getting there as it is about the gold itself. If you found this interesting, please give this video a like and consider subscribing to the channel for more chapters. We'd love to have you with us as we continue to explore this incredible period in history. See you next time.
Imagine stepping back in time to 1848. San Francisco, then called Yerba Buena, is a sleepy, remote village. Fewer than 1,000 souls call this quiet outpost home. It's a place of rolling hills, foggy mornings, and a handful of adobe buildings clustered around a plaza. Life is slow, predictable, and frankly, a bit dull. Fast forward just a couple of years, and this tranquil scene is utterly unrecognizable. It has exploded into a chaotic, sprawling, 24-hour metropolis, teeming with tens of thousands of people from every corner of the globe. What happened? One word: gold. The news from Sutter's mill didn't just start a rush. It lit a fuse under San Francisco, transforming it almost overnight into the frenetic heart of the California dream. As thousands of ships dropped anchor in the bay, their crews often deserted them on the spot. Infected with the same gold fever as their passengers, the city's population swelled at a staggering rate. In 1849 alone, it is estimated that over 40,000 people arrived by sea, and another 40,000 by land. Housing couldn't keep up. In fact, there was almost no housing to speak of. So, what did they do? They improvised. A massive, sprawling canvas town erupted. Streets, if you can call them that, were lined with tents, flimsy wooden shacks, and even structures made from the scraps of abandoned ships. The air was thick with the smoke of campfires, the mud was knee-deep, and the cacophony of a dozen languages filled the air. It was a city built on hope and desperation, a temporary testament to the sheer force of human ambition. This wasn't a city of families and picket fences. It was a city of men, young, restless, and far from home. They sought not just gold, but also distraction, and San Francisco delivered. On every corner, a saloon seemed to spring up, serving whiskey so potent it was nicknamed tarantula juice. Gambling halls were everywhere, their doors swinging open all day and all night. Games of faro, monte, and poker played out for stakes that could make a man rich or ruin him in a single hand. The glint of gold dust was the universal currency, measured out on tiny scales for everything from a drink to a night's lodging. This was the wild, untamed frontier in its most concentrated form, a world of incredible opportunity and equally incredible peril, where fortunes were made and lost before the sun even set. But let's be clear, the story of San Francisco's transformation isn't just about the chaos and the miners. In fact, some of the greatest fortunes weren't dug out of the ground at all. They were made by clever entrepreneurs who realized the real gold mine was the miners themselves. Think about it. Thousands of people arrive with nothing but the clothes on their backs. They need everything: shovels, picks, pans, boots, food, a place to sleep. This created a colossal demand for goods and services. The smartest people weren't chasing glittering nuggets in a cold stream. They were selling the shovels. Enter the merchants. A simple pickaxe that might cost $1 back east could sell for $15 in San Francisco. A barrel of flour could fetch an astronomical price. People like Samuel Brannan, who famously ran through the streets shouting "Gold, gold from the American River," became California's first millionaire, not from mining, but by stocking his store with every conceivable supply a prospector could need. He cornered the market on mining equipment and reaped enormous profits. Others opened hotels, often just rows of cots in a large room, and charged exorbitant rates for a place to sleep. Restaurants, laundries, hardware stores, they all thrived. These were the people building the economic bedrock of the new city. The infrastructure itself became a source of immense wealth, with the streets turning into impassable mud pits. Enterprising individuals laid down wooden planks and charged tolls for people to walk on them. Everything had a price. The demand for lumber to build the city was so intense that entire hillsides were stripped bare. Labor was also at a premium. A carpenter or a blacksmith could earn in a day what they might have earned in a month back home. This economic explosion created a new class of wealthy individuals who weren't grizzled prospectors, but savvy business people who understood the fundamental principles of supply and demand. They saw the bigger picture. So while the popular image of the gold rush is the lone miner panning for gold in a river, the true and lasting legacy was the birth of this great city. San Francisco became the supply depot, the financial center, and the cultural heart of the entire West Coast. It was a city forged in a crucible of ambition, chaos, and incredible economic energy. The tent cities were eventually replaced by brick buildings. The muddy paths became paved streets, and the makeshift port grew into a global hub of commerce. The gold may have been finite, but the city it built was here to stay. It was a testament to the fact that during a gold rush, the most reliable way to get rich is to sell the picks and shovels. The transformation of this once sleepy village into a bustling metropolis is one of the most remarkable stories of urban growth in American history. Thank you so much for watching this chapter of our series. If you found this journey back in time fascinating, please hit that like button and consider subscribing to the channel. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next chapter, where we'll explore the lives of the miners themselves and the harsh realities they faced in the goldfields. We love hearing from you, so leave a comment below and let us know what part of this story surprised you the most. Until next time, stay curious.
Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 8. And let me tell you, it's a gritty one. We're stepping into the heart of the action. Life in the mining camps. Forget everything you think you know from the movies. This was the real deal. And it was anything but glamorous. Imagine arriving after a long, grueling journey, full of hope, only to find a chaotic world carved out of the wilderness. Your new home. It might be a crude log cabin, hastily thrown together with gaps in the walls that let the wind whistle through. If you were less fortunate, you'd be living in a flimsy canvas tent, which offered little protection from the freezing night or the scorching sun. When it rained, the so-called streets transformed into rivers of thick, inescapable mud that could swallow a man's boot hole. This wasn't a town. It was a temporary, desperate settlement clinging to the edge of civilization. Now, let's talk about food. You're working from sunup to sundown, burning thousands of calories, so you'd think a decent meal would be a priority, right? Well, think again. Food was incredibly scarce and outrageously expensive. A single egg could cost the equivalent of $50 today. A loaf of bread, 100. Miners survived on a monotonous diet of beans, bacon, and hard biscuits, often stale or infested with weevils. Fresh fruit and vegetables were a dream. This poor diet, combined with non-existent sanitation, was a recipe for disaster. Clean water was rare, and waste was often just thrown into the nearest stream. It's no surprise that diseases swept through the camps like wildfire, claiming more lives than mining accidents ever did. One of the most fascinating aspects of these camps was the sheer diversity of the people who flocked there, all chasing the same dream. It was a true global melting pot, unlike anything seen before. You had Americans from every state, East Coasters who had never held a pickaxe next to rugged frontiersmen. Alongside them were experienced miners from Mexico, whose knowledge of mining techniques was invaluable. You'd see large groups of Chinese immigrants, hardworking and resilient, who formed their own tight-knit communities within the camps. There were also Europeans from Ireland, Germany, France, and beyond, each bringing their own language and customs. And let's not forget the Native Americans, whose lands were being overrun, and who were often drawn into the chaotic economy of the camps, sometimes trading or working, other times clashing with the newcomers. This incredible mix of cultures created a volatile and dynamic society. In one tent, you might hear English. In the next, Spanish. And just down the path, Cantonese. While this diversity was remarkable, it also led to tension and conflict. Prejudices from the outside world were carried into the camps and often magnified by the harsh conditions and fierce competition for gold. Different groups were often stereotyped, and discriminatory laws were even passed to target certain populations, particularly the Chinese and Mexican miners. Yet, despite the suspicion and occasional hostility, there were also moments of cooperation. When a rockslide trapped a miner, or a fire threatened the entire camp, people from all backgrounds would often come together, their shared humanity overriding their differences, at least for a little while. So, what did they do when they weren't digging for gold? Well, life wasn't all work and no play, but the entertainment was as rough and ready as everything else. The saloon was the center of social life. After a long week of backbreaking labor, Miners would crowd into these noisy, smoky establishments to spend their hard-earned gold dust. Gambling was rampant, with fortunes won and lost on a single hand of cards. Fights were common, fueled by cheap whiskey and simmering disputes. But it wasn't all vice. Music was a huge part of camp life. Men would gather around the campfire with fiddles, banjos, and harmonicas, playing tunes that reminded them of home and the families they'd left behind. These moments of shared music and storytelling provided a much-needed escape from the drudgery and loneliness of their daily existence. It's crucial to understand that for every story of a miner striking it rich, there were thousands who found nothing but hardship. The reality was that most people barely scraped by. They would toil for months, digging, panning, and sluicing, only to find just enough gold to pay for their overpriced supplies and maybe send a small amount home. Many fell into debt to the camp store owners, who held all the power. The dream of quick riches often faded, replaced by the grim reality of survival. The psychological toll was immense. The isolation, the physical exhaustion, and the constant disappointment led many to despair. It was a life of extreme highs and devastating lows, a constant gamble where the odds were stacked against you. Life in the mining camps was a raw, unfiltered slice of human ambition and struggle. It was a world of mud, sweat, and hope, populated by a diverse cast of characters all chasing a golden dream. It was a place of incredible hardship, but also of surprising resilience and community. These camps were the crucibles where a new kind of society was forged, one that would shape the future of the American West in profound ways. It was a tough life, a dangerous life, and for most, an unrewarding one. But it is a chapter of our history that is absolutely essential to understanding the forces that built this nation. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the mining camps. I hope it gave you a new perspective on this iconic era. If you found this interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel for more chapters of our historical journey. Don't forget to ring the notification bell so you won't miss our next episode. We love hearing from you, so drop your thoughts and questions in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Camera opens on a shot of a clear flowing river, then pans to a collection of antique gold mining tools laid out on a rustic wooden table. A gold pan, a small sluice box, and a model of a rocker cradle. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our journey through history. In today's chapter, Tools of the Trade, we're digging deep into the very heart of the gold rush, to ingenious and sometimes destructive methods that prospectors used to chase their glittering dreams. So grab your gear, because we're heading back to the gold fields when the first whispers of gold turned into a roar. The earliest miners relied on tools that were simple, portable, and as old as the pursuit of gold itself. The most iconic, of course, is the gold pan. Imagine standing knee-deep in a freezing river, swirling sand and gravel in this simple metal dish, your eyes straining for that telltale glint. It was back-breaking, tedious work. You'd scoop up some promising gravel, add water, and begin the careful process of washing away the lighter material, sand, dirt, and small rocks, leaving the heavier gold behind. It required a unique flick of the wrist, a skill that separated the seasoned prospector from the greenhorn. For many, this pan was their entire operation, their single hope for striking it rich. But panning was slow. To process more gravel and increase their chances, miners quickly adopted more efficient tools. Enter the rocker cradle. Picture a wooden box on rockers, like a child's cradle, with a sieve on top and riffle small berries along its sloped bottom. One miner would shovel gravel into the top, while another rocked the cradle back and forth and poured water over it. The water would wash the lighter material through, while the heavier gold would get trapped by the riffles. It was a two-person job, a step up in teamwork and efficiency. You could process far more material in a day with a cradle than with a pan alone. The next evolution was the sluice box. This was the workhorse of the early goldfields. Think of it as a long, man-made channel, a sort of artificial riverbed. Miners would build these long wooden troughs and place them in a stream, diverting water through them. The bottom of the sluice was lined with riffles, and sometimes even mercury, to help amalgamate the fine gold particles. Entire teams of miners would work together, shoveling massive amounts of gravel into the head of the sluice box. The constant flow of water did the work of separating the materials, washing away the worthless debris while the precious gold settled and got trapped. At the end of the day, or week, they'd do a cleanup, carefully removing the riffles and collecting the concentrated gold. Sluice boxers allowed miners to process tons of gravel, transforming small-scale prospecting into a more organized, group effort. These early methods, while effective, were still limited by manpower. As the easily accessible place of gold, the loose gold in riverbeds began to dwindle. The nature of the gold rush changed dramatically. The era of the lone prospector with his pan and mule was drawing to a close, and the age of industrial mining was dawning. This transition was driven by one thing: the desire to get at the gold locked away in ancient riverbeds, high up on hillsides and buried deep underground. This led to the rise of hydraulic mining, a method as powerful as it was destructive. Imagine giant water cannons, called monitors, blasting hillsides with high-pressure jets of water. These cannons were so powerful they could dislodge boulders the size of small cars and literally wash entire mountainsides away. The resulting slurry of water, mud, rock, and gold was then directed through enormous, complex sluice systems to capture the precious metal. This was mining on an industrial scale, financed by wealthy companies and operated by large crews. It was incredibly efficient at extracting gold, but it came at a staggering environmental cost. The consequences were catastrophic and permanent. Entire landscapes were reshaped in a matter of years. Hillsides that had stood for millennia were turned into barren, ghostly badlands, scarred by deep canyons. The sheer volume of debris, sand, gravel, and mud, known as slickens, was washed into the river systems. Rivers that once ran clear became choked with sediment. This raised riverbeds, causing devastating floods downstream that destroyed farms, orchards, and entire communities. The agricultural lands of the central valleys were buried under feet of sterile mining debris. Mercury, used extensively in the sluices to capture fine gold, contaminated the water, poisoning fish and wildlife, and creating a toxic legacy that persists in some areas even today. The beautiful, pristine wilderness that had greeted the first prospectors was, in many places, gone forever, sacrificed for the sake of gold. This widespread destruction eventually led to legal battles between farmers and miners, culminating in court rulings that severely restricted hydraulic mining. It was a crucial moment, one of the first major environmental conflicts in American history, highlighting the tension between economic pursuits and the preservation of our natural world. So, from the simple pan to the destructive power of the hydraulic monitor, the tools of the trade tell a story not just of ingenuity and ambition, but also of unforeseen consequences. The gold rush wasn't just about finding gold. It was about the relentless drive to innovate, to conquer nature, and the hard lessons learned about the true cost of progress. It's a powerful reminder that our actions, especially our pursuit of resources, can have lasting impacts on the world around us. Thanks so much for joining me for this chapter. The story of the gold rush is complex, filled with triumph and tragedy, and I'm glad we could explore this part of it together. If you enjoyed this video and learned something new, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel so you don't miss our next chapter. We've got more amazing stories to uncover. Until next time, stay curious.
Welcome back to our journey through history. Today, we're diving into Chapter 10, Fortune and Failure, exploring the dazzling highs and devastating lows of the California gold rush. It was a time that promised untold riches, a dream that lured hundreds of thousands to the untamed West. Was it truly a golden opportunity for everyone? Let's find out. Imagine this. You've traveled for months, leaving everything behind, all for the chance to find a life-changing fortune. For a select few, this dream became a reality. We hear the legendary tales, like the story of the two partners who reportedly stumbled upon a single nugget so large it weighed over 195 pounds. News of such incredible finds spread like wildfire, fanning the flames of gold fever across the globe. These stories weren't just rumors. They were powerful magnets pulling people from every corner of the earth towards California, each one hoping to be the next lucky soul to strike it rich. They envisioned a life of luxury, of never having to worry about money again. These tales of instant millionaires became the very engine of the gold rush, a powerful narrative of hope and possibility that defined an era. But here's the reality check. For every miner who struck gold, there were thousands who didn't. The vast majority of prospectors found nothing but hardship. The work was backbreaking, grueling, and often dangerous. They stood for hours in ice-cold river water, digging and sifting through endless tons of dirt and rock under the scorching sun. Disease was rampant in the crowded, unsanitary mining camps. A simple illness could be a death sentence. And what did most have to show for it? Empty pockets and shattered dreams. They had spent their life savings just to get to California, and many fell into deep debt simply buying the basic tools and food they needed to survive. The dream of gold quickly turned into a nightmare of poverty, disappointment, and despair. So if most of the miners weren't getting rich, who was? The real winners of the gold rush were often the clever entrepreneurs who mined the miners, not the mountains. Take a man named Samuel Brennan. When the first whispers of gold started, Brennan didn't grab a pickaxe. Instead, he bought up every shovel, pan and pick he could find. Then, he ran through the streets of San Francisco shouting, "Gold! Gold from the American River!" As prospectors rushed in, Brennan sold them their supplies at wildly inflated prices. A pan that cost 20 cents was sold for $15. He became one of the first and wealthiest millionaires of the gold rush without ever sifting a single ounce of gold himself. He understood that in a gold rush, the surest bet is selling the shovels. And then there's a name you definitely know, Levi Strauss. He arrived in San Francisco with a load of canvas, intending to make tents for the miners. But he quickly noticed a problem. The miners' pants were constantly ripping and wearing out from the tough conditions, so Strauss had a brilliant idea. He took his durable canvas and instead of tents, he made rugged, tough-as-nails work pants. Later, he switched to a sturdy French fabric called serge d'encheims, which soon became known as denim. He added copper rivets to the stress points to make them even stronger. These weren't just pants. They were a solution to a real-world problem. Levi's denim jeans were born, becoming the unofficial uniform of the American West and eventually a global fashion icon. Like Brannon, Levi Strauss became incredibly wealthy, not by finding gold, but by fulfilling a need for the people who were. The stories of Brannon and Strauss reveal a crucial lesson about the gold rush. The most sustainable fortunes were built on providing goods and services, not on the gamble of prospecting. While miners chased a fleeting dream, merchants, hoteliers, saloon keepers, and blacksmiths built stable businesses. They created the infrastructure that supported the massive influx of people. San Francisco transformed from a sleepy village into a bustling metropolis almost overnight, all thanks to the commerce surrounding the gold fields. These entrepreneurs weren't just lucky. They were strategic. They saw the bigger picture and capitalized on the predictable needs of a large, desperate population. They were building an economy, not just chasing a treasure. Their success underscores the idea that innovation and business acumen are often more valuable than a lucky strike. So, when we look back at the gold rush, it's a complex story of contrasts. It's a story of incredible, almost mythical fortune for a handful of individuals. Their rags to riches tales are what we remember, the legends that have been passed down through generations. But it's also a story of immense failure and hardship for the overwhelming majority. It's a stark reminder that get-rich-quick schemes rarely pan out for most people. The real, lasting legacy wasn't just the gold pulled from the ground, but the cities that were built, the industries that were born, and the entrepreneurial spirit that was forged. It taught us that sometimes the greatest treasures aren't buried in the earth, but are found in ingenuity, hard work, and seeing a need that no one else does. The gold rush reshaped a nation, but not always in the way people expected. Thank you so much for joining me on this deep dive into the fortunes and failures of the gold rush. It's a fascinating chapter of history with lessons that still resonate today. If you enjoyed this video and want to explore more stories from the past, please hit that like button and subscribe to the channel so you don't miss our next adventure. Your support means the world to us. Let me know in the comments what historical event you'd like to see us cover next. Until then, stay curious. Welcome back, history buffs and adventurers. Today, we re-stepping back in time to an era of raw ambition and untamed frontiers, the California Gold Rush. Talked about the journey, the digging, and the dreams of striking it rich. But what happened when things went wrong? What happened when greed, desperation, and a whole lot of whiskey were mixed together in a place with no rules? Let's dive into the gritty reality of lawlessness and justice in the goldfields. Imagine this. You've just traveled thousands of miles, leaving everything behind. You're in a sprawling, chaotic camp, surrounded by thousands of strangers from every corner of the globe, all chasing the same glittering prize. There are no mayors, no police departments, no courthouses. The nearest official government might be days or even weeks away. Who do you turn to if someone steals your gold dust, jumps your claim, or worse? This was the stark reality for the 49ers. They were living in a power vacuum, a social experiment where civilization was stripped down to its bare essentials. In this environment, disputes weren't settled by a judge in a black robe. They were often settled with fists, knives, or the cold, hard logic of a Colt revolver. The most common form of law was simply the threat of force. A man had to be ready to defend his life and his property at a moment's notice. The line between a prospector and a fighter was incredibly thin. You couldn't just be good with a pickaxe. You had to be willing to stand your ground, because you could be sure someone else was willing to take it from you. This constant tension created an atmosphere thick with suspicion and the ever-present possibility of violence. When a crime was committed, especially something as serious as theft or murder, the community didn't wait for an official response. They took matters into their own hands. This is where the concept of miners' justice comes in. A miners' court would be assembled on the spot. It wasn't a formal institution. It was simply the men in the camp gathering together. Someone would stand on a tree stump or a barrel and shout for everyone's attention. The accused would be brought forward. Witnesses would give their accounts, often shouting over one another, and a verdict would be reached by a popular vote. Guilty! Or not guilty! Shouted by the crowd. The punishments were swift, severe, and public. There were no prisons to hold people. If found guilty of a lesser crime, like a small theft, a man might be whipped, have his ear cropped, or be branded with a letter T for thief, so that every other camp would know his crime. Then he'd be banished, kicked out of the camp and told never to return. This was practically a death sentence in the harsh wilderness. For more serious crimes like murder or repeated claim jumping, the punishment was almost always hanging. A rope would be thrown over the branch of a sturdy oak tree, and justice, as they saw it, would be served within minutes of the verdict. These impromptu courts were a double-edged sword. On one hand, they provided a necessary, if brutal, sense of order in a lawless land. They created a deterrent, a clear message that certain actions would not be tolerated. However, this system was incredibly prone to error and mob mentality. Was the accused always given a fair chance to speak? Were the witnesses telling the truth or settling an old score? A rush to judgment, fueled by anger and fear, could easily lead to an innocent man being punished or even executed. This was the dark side of vigilante justice. It was as chaotic and unpredictable as the society it was trying to control. Now, let's talk about daily life. It wasn't all high-stakes crime and punishment. The camps were also filled with a constant, simmering level of vice and violence. After a long, back-breaking day of standing in ice-cold water, panning for a few specks of gold, what did miners do to blow off steam? They drank, and they gambled. Saloons and gambling tents were everywhere. Rough structures made of canvas and wood, but they were the social centers of the camps. Inside, fortunes were won and lost on a single hand of cards. A man who had spent months toiling for a pouch of gold dust could lose it all in a matter of minutes. This combination of alcohol, high-stakes gambling, and a room full of armed, exhausted, and often desperate men was a recipe for disaster. Arguments erupted constantly. An accusation of cheating, a drunken insult, a dispute over a card game, any of these could escalate into a full-blown brawl in seconds. And these weren't simple fistfights. Remember, nearly every man was armed. Duels, though sometimes portrayed as formal affairs, were often just sudden, deadly shootouts. The code of the West was still being written, and in the gold camps it was written in blood. The idea of an eye for an eye was the prevailing philosophy. An insult to a man's honor had to be answered, often with deadly force. The violence wasn't just limited to disputes between miners. The camps attracted a whole ecosystem of predators. Professional gamblers, con artists, and outright bandits saw the goldfields not as a place to work, but as a place to prey on those who did. Gangs of outlaws, like the infamous Hounds in San Francisco, terrorized communities, extorting money from businesses and targeting minority groups. These organized criminals were a step above the common camp brawls, representing a more sinister and calculated threat. They thrived in the legal vacuum, knowing that their victims had little recourse. Eventually, as the gold rush matured, efforts to establish more formal systems of law and order began to take hold. As towns grew from chaotic camps into more permanent settlements, citizens started demanding real government. They elected sheriffs, appointed judges, and built proper courthouses and jails. Vigilante committees, like the famous ones in San Francisco in the 1850s, were formed by prominent citizens to systematically root out the criminal elements that had taken hold. While still technically operating outside the law, these committees were more organized and methodical than the spontaneous miners' courts. They represented a transitional phase, a bridge between mob rule and civil society. The story of law and justice during the gold rush is a fascinating and brutal chapter of American history. It shows us what happens when the structures of society are stripped away and people are left to govern themselves. It's a tale of survival, of rough justice, and of the slow, difficult process of building a community from scratch in the middle of nowhere. It reminds us that the Wild West wasn't just a romantic fantasy. It was a real, dangerous place where life was cheap, and order was a luxury that had to be fought for every single day. Thanks so much for joining me on this journey into the past. It's a powerful reminder of how far our legal systems have come. If you found this glimpse into the gritty reality of the gold rush interesting, please hit that like button and subscribe for more deep dives into history. Let me know in the comments what you think. Could you have survived in a California gold camp? We'll see you next time.
Hello everyone, and welcome back to our historical journey. Today, we are diving deep into a chapter of the gold rush that is often overlooked, the incredible story of the women who shaped this pivotal era. When we picture the California gold rush, our minds usually conjure images of grizzled prospectors with pickaxes and pans, searching for that life-changing glitter. But what about the other half of the story? While men flocked to the mines, a small but mighty contingent of women carved out their own destinies, not with a pickaxe, but with ingenuity, resilience, and sheer hard work. Let's set the scene. Imagine the chaotic, dusty, and overwhelmingly male-dominated boom towns of the 1850s. We're talking about places like San Francisco, Sacramento, and countless smaller mining camps. The ratio of men to women was staggering, sometimes as high as 60 to 1. In this rough-and-tumbled world, the few women who were present weren't just background characters. They were the essential gears that kept the entire machine running. They were the civilizing force, the entrepreneurs, and the backbone of the burgeoning society. One of the most common and vital roles for women was running boarding houses. Think about it. Thousands of single men, far from home, with no one to cook, clean, or mend for them. They arrived exhausted after a long day in the mines, covered in dirt and hungry. A warm meal and a clean bed were luxuries they were more than willing to pay top dollar for. Women who opened their homes, or even just a simple tent, two boarders found themselves in an incredibly lucrative business. They weren't just providing a service. They were creating a semblance of home in a wild and untamed land. A woman could often earn more in a week by cooking and washing than her husband could by panning for gold. And speaking of washing, let's talk about laundry. It might sound mundane today, but in the gold rush, clean clothes were a precious commodity. Miners would wear their clothes until they were stiff with grime. Laundresses, often charging exorbitant prices, became some of the earliest female entrepreneurs of the West. One famous account tells of a woman who earned thousands of dollars simply by washing miners' shirts. They turned a domestic chore into a powerful economic engine, proving that you didn't need to find a gold nugget to strike it rich. They found their gold in soap and water, scrubbing their way to financial independence in a world that offered them few other paths. Beyond these essential services, women were also shopkeepers, bakers, seamstresses, and entertainers. They ran businesses that catered to the needs of the booming population. Some opened restaurants, providing a welcome change from the miners' monotonous diet of bacon and beans. Others sold pies, bread, and other goods that reminded men of the comforts they had left behind. These women were sharp business operators who understood the principles of supply and demand long before it was a buzzword. They saw a need, and they filled it, transforming their domestic skills into profitable enterprises and becoming respected figures in their communities. Let's take a look at San Francisco, the epicenter of the gold rush boom. While many women were working day and night in the mining camps, a select few were climbing the social and economic ladder in the city. Women like Mary Ellen Pleasant, an African-American abolitionist and entrepreneur, amassed a fortune through savvy investments in restaurants, laundries, and boarding houses. She used her wealth and influence to help others, becoming a powerful and celebrated figure. Then there was Sarah Royce, whose memoirs give us a vivid picture of what it was like to arrive in this new world. Her story, like many others, is one of incredible endurance and adaptation as she and her family navigated the challenges of building a life from scratch. These women weren't just lucky. They were strategic, bold, and unafraid to seize the opportunities that this new, fluid society presented. They proved that a woman's place was wherever she chose to make it. However, it's crucial to remember that the gold rush wasn't a golden opportunity for everyone. For every woman who found success, there were countless others whose lives were turned upside down. The mass exodus of men to the West had a profound and often devastating impact on family life back east. Wives and children were left behind, sometimes for years, with little to no financial support. These women, often called California widows, had to manage farms, raise children, and handle all the household affairs entirely on their own. The letters they exchanged with their husbands are filled with longing, anxiety, and the immense strain of separation. The promise of gold often came at the high price of a fractured family, and many families were never reached. For the women who did make the perilous journey west with their families, life was anything but easy. The overland trail was fraught with danger, disease, and exhaustion. Once they arrived, they faced primitive living conditions, a lack of community, and the constant uncertainty of life in the gold fields. While their husbands were away for weeks or months at a time, women were left to defend their homes, care for sick children, and manage with scarce resources. They were pioneers in the truest sense of the word, demonstrating a level of fortitude that is simply. Their story is not one of riches and glamour, but one of survival and resilience against incredible odds. The gold rush also attracted women from all over the world, including from Mexico, Chile, China, and Europe. These women faced not only the hardships of the frontier, but also intense prejudice and discrimination. They were often marginalized and their contributions ignored. Yet, they too played a role in shaping the multicultural fabric of California. They brought their own traditions, foods, and skills, enriching the cultural landscape in ways that are still visible today. Their stories are a vital part of this complex history, reminding us that the gold rush was a global phenomenon with a diverse cast of characters, each with their own struggles and triumphs. So, as we close this chapter, let's adjust our mental picture of the gold rush. Let's add the women to the frame. See the boarding house owner haggling over the price of a room, the laundress scrubbing shirts by the riverbank, the entrepreneur in San Francisco signing a business deal, and the California widow back east holding her family together with sheer willpower. Their numbers may have been few, but their impact was immense. They were the glue that held society together, the entrepreneurs who built the economy, and the pioneers who laid the foundations for modern California. They didn't just witness history, they actively made it. Their legacy is a powerful testament to the fact that strength, innovation, and the spirit of adventure are not defined by gender. Thank you so much for joining me today to uncover these hidden stories. If you found this journey into the past as fascinating as I did, please hit that like button. And do you forget to subscribe and turn on notifications so you won't miss our next historical adventure. I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious. Hey everyone, and welcome back to our series. Today, we're diving into a topic that is absolutely crucial for understanding the true story of the American West. The profound and often devastating impact of westward expansion on Native American communities. This is Chapter 13. Before we begin, it's important to acknowledge that this is a heavy and sensitive subject. The stories we'll discuss involve immense loss and hardship. Our goal here is to learn from history with respect and honesty, to understand the full picture, not just the romanticized version. So, let's set the stage. For thousands of years before the first European settlers arrived, the lands we now call the American West were home to hundreds of distinct and vibrant native nations. These weren't just empty spaces on a map. They were homelands filled with complex societies, trade networks, spiritual sites, and generations of history. Each tribe, from the Mohawk and Yurok in what is now California to the Lakota and Cheyenne on the Great Plains, had a deep, intricate connection to their environment. Their cultures, economies, and spiritual beliefs were woven into the very fabric of the land they inhabited. But the 19th century brought a tidal wave of change. The idea of manifest destiny, the belief that the United States was destined to expand across the continent, became a powerful force driving settlers westward. And with the discovery of gold in California in 1848, what was a steady stream of migration turned into an unstoppable flood. The gold rush, in particular, acted as a massive accelerant, drawing hundreds of thousands of people from all over the world into territories that had been native homelands for millennia. This sudden, massive influx of people had immediate and catastrophic consequences. The first and most direct impact was displacement. Prospectors, settlers, and miners swarmed onto native lands, often with complete disregard for the people who lived there. Treaties that had been signed often under duress were frequently ignored or broken the moment valuable resources were discovered. Entire villages were uprooted. Families who had lived in a specific valley or by a certain river for countless generations were suddenly told they had to leave. They were pushed onto smaller, less desirable parcels of land, called reservations, or forced to flee into unfamiliar territories, often leading to conflicts with other tribes who were also being displaced. Imagine your home, the place where your ancestors are buried, the land that provides your food and is central to your spiritual life, suddenly being overrun by strangers who see it only for its monetary value. This wasn't just a loss of property. It was an attack on their entire way of life, their identity, and their connection to the past and future. Alongside this forced displacement came another, often invisible, but equally deadly invader disease. Native Americans had no natural immunity to the illnesses that European and American migrants brought with them, such as smallpox, measles, and influenza. These diseases swept through native communities like wildfire. In many areas, especially in the densely populated regions of California, entire villages were wiped out before they even had significant direct contact with the newcomers. Historians estimate that in California alone, the native population, which was around 150,000 before the gold rush, plummeted by more than 80% in just a couple of decades. This wasn't just a side effect of migration. It was a demographic catastrophe on a scale that is difficult to comprehend. The loss of life was staggering, and it created a ripple effect of trauma and instability. The death of elders meant the loss of invaluable knowledge, languages, traditions, and historical memory. The loss of so many adults left communities fractured, struggling to care for orphans and maintain their social structures. But the tragedy didn't end with displacement and disease. The period of westward expansion was also marked by shocking levels of violence. The newcomers, driven by a desire for land and gold, often viewed native people as obstacles to be removed. This led to a brutal cycle of conflict. While we often hear stories of Indian wars, much of the violence was not organized warfare, but rather unprovoked attacks, massacres of non-combatants, and vigilante justice. In California, for example, the state government and local militias actively encouraged the extermination of native people. Bounties were offered for scalps, and so-called volunteer expeditions were funded to hunt down and kill native men, women, and children. It was a state-sanctioned campaign of terror. These weren't isolated incidents. They were part of a widespread pattern of violence intended to clear the land for settlement and mining. This brutal reality stands in stark contrast to the heroic pioneer narrative we're often taught. The taming of the West was, for its original inhabitants, a period of unimaginable terror and violence. The final piece of this tragic puzzle was the systematic destruction of the resources that native communities depended on for survival. The gold rush, for instance, devastated the environment. Hydraulic mining operations washed away entire hillsides, choking rivers with sediment and debris. This destroyed the salmon runs that many tribes, like the Yurok and Karak, relied on as a primary food source. Forests were clear-cut for timber to build mining towns and support shafts, eliminating the habitats of animals that were crucial for hunting. The vast herds of bison on the Great Plains, central to the culture and survival of tribes like the Lakota, Sioux, and Cheyenne, were hunted to near extinction, not just for their hides, but as a deliberate military strategy to starve the Plains tribes into submission and force them onto reservations. By destroying the environment, the newcomers were effectively destroying the native economy. It made it impossible for many communities to continue their traditional ways of life, hunting, fishing, and gathering. This economic collapse, combined with the loss of land and the constant threat of violence, created a state of forced dependency. Tribes that had been self-sufficient for thousands of years were now reliant on government rations, which were often inadequate, poor quality, and used as a tool of control. So, when we put all these pieces together, the forced removal from ancestral lands, the devastating epidemics, the widespread violence, and the destruction of their environment and economy, we begin to see the full scope of the impact. The gold rush and westward expansion didn't just disrupt native communities. In many cases, they shattered them. It was a period of profound cultural and population decline, driven by policies and actions that ranged from callous indifference to outright genocide. The resilience of Native American peoples in the face of this onslaught is truly remarkable. Despite everything they endured, they fought to survive. They resisted both through armed conflict and through diplomatic and legal means. They worked to preserve their languages, their ceremonies, and their traditions, often in secret. The story of Native Americans in the 19th century is not just one of victory. It is also a story of incredible strength, survival, and enduring cultural spirit. Understanding this history is not about assigning blame or making people feel guilty. It's about seeking the truth. It is about acknowledging the full cost of westward expansion and recognizing that the prosperity and growth of the United States came at a devastating price for the continent's original inhabitants. By facing this difficult part of our past, we can gain a more complete and honest understanding of who we are as a nation and honor the memory of those who suffered. It also helps us appreciate the ongoing struggles and incredible resilience of Native communities today as they continue to fight for their rights, reclaim their heritage, and heal from generations of trauma. Thank you so much for joining me for this important chapter. I know this was a lot to take in, but it's a conversation we need to have. If you found this video insightful, please give it a thumbs up and consider subscribing to the channel for more deep dives into history. And as always, I'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Let's keep the conversation going with respect and a willingness to learn. Thanks for watching, and I'll see you in the next chapter.
Imagine a place where the world turned upside down in a single year. That place was California in 1849. Just 12 months earlier, it was a quiet, sun-drenched frontier of missions and cattle ranches. But then, a single word echoed across the globe: gold. Suddenly, the quiet was shattered. San Francisco Bay became a forest of abandoned ships, their crews having vanished into the hills, chasing whispers of fortune. Across the plains, wagon trains carved new roads into the earth, kicking up dust that stretched for miles. Even the deadly jungles of Panama teemed with dreamers, all convinced that paradise and wealth lay just beyond the horizon. By the end of 1849, over 100,000 people had flooded into California. This wasn't a migration, it was an invasion of hope. Towns made of tents and rough-hewn wood sprang up overnight. The constant sound was the ring of hammers and the clatter of pickaxes, but this explosive growth came at a price. California was a land in limbo, a legal black hole. The United States had won California from Mexico in 1848, but it was just a territory, and a territory without a government. There were no official laws, no courts, no police. In the goldfields, disputes were settled with the swing of a pickaxe or a quick vote by fellow miners. In the booming city of San Francisco, merchants argued over contracts in smoky saloons and settled their debts with pistols. Gold dust, measured by the pinch and carried in leather pouches, was the currency, but there were no banks to hold it. Chaos was king, crime ran rampant. Gambling dens and brothels far outnumbered schools and churches. In a desperate attempt to create order, ordinary citizens formed vigilante committees, handing out rough justice in a world teetering on the edge of violence. But beneath all this disorder, a powerful idea was taking root. The people of California realized they had grown too large, too fast, and too important to be ignored. They weren't just an outpost anymore. They were a society. They refused to wait for Washington, D.C. to appoint a governor or impose laws from thousands of miles away. They decided to take matters into their own hands. So in the autumn of 1849, they called for a constitutional convention. They gathered in Monterey, the old Spanish and Mexican capital, a place steeped in history. 48 delegates assembled in the town's old customs house. Most were American newcomers, fresh off the trail, but they were joined by a handful of Californios, the original Hispanic residents of the land. Inside that historic building, they debated the future, arguing in both English and Spanish. They were building a state from scratch. One question overshadowed all others. Would California permit slavery? The gold rush had drawn people from both the North and the South. But mining, with its individualistic, backbreaking labor, wasn't suited for the plantation system. The Northern delegates were firm. After intense debate, the decision was made: California would be a free state. This single decision would send shockwaves across the entire nation, shaking the very foundations of the Union. With that settled, the delegates hammered out the rest of the Constitution, creating a government with a governor, a legislature, and a court system. They drew ambitious borders, stretching from the Pacific to the Sierra Nevada mountains. With the ink still wet on the document, they sent a bold message to Washington: "We are not asking to become a state. We are a state. Now recognize us." When this news reached Congress, it ignited a firestorm. In 1850, the United States was a nation deeply divided. There was an equal number of free states and slave states, creating a fragile balance of power in the Senate. California's entry as a free state would shatter that balance, giving the North a clear advantage. Southern leaders like John C. Calhoun were furious. They saw it as a direct threat to their way of life and their political power. They threatened secession, warning that the Union itself was at risk. Northern leaders, like William Seward, argued just as passionately that freedom was California's birthright and that slavery had no place on its golden soil. The nation was on the brink of collapse. Into this crisis stepped a legendary figure, Senator Henry Clay of Kentucky, known as the Great Compromiser. He had saved the Union from splitting apart before, and he was determined to do it again. Clay proposed a complex, sweeping package of laws that would become known as the Compromise of 1850. It was a delicate balancing act. To please the North, California would be admitted as a free state. To appease the South, a much stricter fugitive slave law would be enacted, forcing Northerners to help capture and return escaped slaves. Other new territories, like Utah and New Mexico, would get to decide the slavery issue for themselves. And in a symbolic gesture to abolitionists, the slave trade, but not slavery itself, would be banned in the nation's capital, Washington, D.C. For 8 long months, Congress was consumed by furious debate. The fate of the nation hung in the balance. But finally, in September of 1850, the compromise was passed. California was officially admitted to the Union as the 31st state. The news traveled slowly, by ship and by horse, but when it finally reached San Francisco, the city erupted in celebration. Cannons roared across the bay. Flags were hoisted over the chaotic mix of shacks and tents. It was a moment of profound validation. The wild, unruly, gold-crazed land was now a legitimate part of the American experiment. Of course, statehood wasn't a magic wand. The new government faced enormous challenges. How could it enforce laws across such a vast and rugged landscape? How could it protect the rights of the Californios and Native Americans in a society now dominated by English-speaking newcomers? How could the raw chaos of the gold rush finally be tamed? These questions would take decades to answer. But joining the Union gave California a framework, a structure, and a place in the national story. The gold rush had created a new society at breathtaking speed, and the fight for statehood had secured its future, setting the stage for the California we know today, a diverse, dynamic, and ever-evolving land of dreams. Thanks so much for watching. If you found this piece of history as fascinating as I do, make sure to hit that like button and subscribe for more stories. See you in the next video. Hello and welcome back to our series. Today we're diving into the final chapter of one of history's most electrifying sagas. Chapter 15. The Legacy of the Gold Rush. This isn't just about wrapping up a story. It's about understanding how a single glint of gold in a California riverbed forever altered the course of a nation and, in many ways, the world. The gold rush was more than a frantic scramble for wealth. It was a catalyst for monumental change, and its echoes still resonate today. So, how did a quiet, sparsely populated territory transform into the powerhouse state we know as California? In a word, gold. Before 1848, California was a remote outpost. But the discovery at Sutter's mill triggered a tidal wave of humanity. Hundreds of thousands of people from every corner of the globe descended upon the region, each one chasing a dream. This massive, unprecedented migration fundamentally reshaped California's economy. Suddenly, sleepy settlements like San Francisco exploded into bustling metropolises, their harbors choked with ships, their streets teeming with prospectors, merchants, and opportunists. This rapid growth demanded infrastructure. Roads, bridges, and eventually, railways were built at a breakneck pace to connect mining camps to supply centers. Agriculture boomed not to export, but to feed the ever-growing population of miners. Farmers found their own gold in selling produce, livestock, and grain at inflated prices. New industries sprouted up to support the mining efforts, manufacturing tools, lumber for construction, and banking to manage the newfound wealth. In essence, the gold rush laid the economic foundation for modern California, diversifying its economy far beyond the gold fields and setting it on a path to become the economic giant it is today. It fast-tracked California's statehood, making it the 31st state in the Union in 1850, a remarkably swift transition that bypassed the usual territorial phase. The social fabric of California was also rewoven almost overnight. The influx of people created one of the most diverse societies on the planet at the time. You had Americans from the East Coast mingling with immigrants from Latin America, Europe, Australia, and China. This wasn't always a harmonious blend. The competition for gold was fierce and often led to conflict and prejudice. Yet, it also created a unique cultural melting pot, a society defined by its constant churn of new arrivals and new ideas. This dynamic multicultural identity became a defining characteristic of California. However, this legacy is a complex one. The rapid influx of settlers had devastating consequences for Native American populations, who were displaced, decimated by disease, and subjected to violence. The environment also paid a heavy price. Hydraulic mining, a technique developed to blast gold from hillsides with high-pressure water cannons, tore apart mountains, choked rivers with sediment, and destroyed ecosystems. The scars of this aggressive pursuit of gold are still visible on the Californian landscape today, a stark reminder of the environmental cost of the rush. Perhaps the most enduring legacy of the gold rush is an idea, an ethos that became deeply embedded in the American psyche, the American dream. The gold rush wasn't just about gold. It was about the promise of transformation. It was the idea that anyone, regardless of their background, could venture west, work hard, and strike it rich. It was the ultimate story of opportunity, of reinventing oneself, of achieving prosperity through sheer grit and a little bit of luck. This narrative captured the imagination of the world. It fueled westward expansion and became a cornerstone of American identity, the belief in upward mobility and the possibility of a better life waiting just over the horizon. Now we must confront the myth versus the reality. The romantic image of the lone prospector, joyfully striking a massive gold nugget, is largely a fabrication. The truth is, very few actually found their fortune in the goldfields. The 49 ers who arrived early had the best chance, but soon the easily accessible surface gold was gone. Many who followed ended up broke, working for wages in dangerous conditions or succumbing to disease and hardship. The real fortunes were often made not by the miners, but by the entrepreneurs who sold them supplies. People like Levi Strauss, who sold durable denim pants to miners or bankers, and merchants who controlled the flow of goods and money, were the ones who truly struck it rich. So the American dream born from the gold rush was, for most, just that, a dream. The reality was a grueling struggle for survival. Yet the power of the myth was undeniable. It was the hope, not necessarily the outcome, that drew people in. This gap between the dream and the reality is a crucial part of the legacy. It tells a story about human aspiration, the risks people are willing to take for a chance at a better life, and the often unseen economic forces that truly shape fortunes. Let's take a moment to reflect on the sheer scale of this event. It all started with one man, James Marshall, noticing something shiny in a mill race in a quiet remote valley. That single, almost accidental discovery set off a chain reaction that rippled across the globe. It triggered one of the largest mass migrations in human history, pulling people from every continent and culture towards a single destination. It accelerated the development of a nation, created a state, and forged a global economic network. Think about it, a carpenter's glance sparked a global phenomenon. It shows how history can turn on a dime, how a single event can unleash forces that reshape societies, economies, and even the land itself. The gold rush is a powerful lesson in cause and effect, demonstrating how the allure of wealth can drive human behavior on a massive scale, for better and for worse. It's a story of creation and destruction, of dreams realized and dreams shattered, all stemming from that initial discovery at Sutter's Mill. In conclusion, the legacy of the gold rush is not a simple story of success or failure. It is a complex tapestry woven with threads of immense wealth and desperate poverty, of cultural exchange and violent conflict, of incredible innovation and environmental devastation. It transformed California from a forgotten frontier into a cornerstone of America, and it gave the world a powerful if complicated new ideal, the American dream. The gold rush may be over, but its impact is all around us in California's dynamic culture, its powerful economy, its diverse population, and in the enduring belief that opportunity and a fresh start are always possible. It's a reminder that beneath the surface of history lie powerful currents of hope, ambition, and the unending human quest for something more. Thank you so much for joining me on this journey through the legacy of the gold rush. I hope you found it as fascinating as I do. If you enjoyed this video, please give it a thumbs up. And don't forget to subscribe and hit that notification bell so you won't miss our next historical adventure. We'd love to hear your thoughts in the comments below. Until next time, stay curious,